right, so continuing with these written responses, looking at 3D, again, notice the word count here. This is for all parts of 3D combined. This is where things get kind of interesting. So when we talk about describing two calls to the function that you identified earlier, but each call must pass a different argument, and it has to cause a different segment of code in the algorithm to execute. So the plain English way of saying that, right, is that based on the inputs to this function, the behavior of the program should change. And really what they're looking for here is an algorithm that changes its behavior based on the input with an if-else or if-elif chain statement. Okay, so it's important as you're thinking about how you're designing your code, whatever happens sort of organically as you're building it, you think, okay, well, how can I create a function around this particular segment of code that uses parameters, and then those parameters have some effect on the program, and then we use like an if or else statement. And we'll look at some examples of that in the future. In this case, it's pretty straightforward. We're just describing what conditions are being tested. This is basically what's in your if statement. And that's pretty much it for the written responses. So those are the big, this one right here, like having a function that runs differently based on parameter input, having your list and talking about your list accurately. Those are the big things. And so we're going to look at now the rubric for the create task. So again, I know that this is like this seems like a ton of information, and it is, it's quite a bit, but it's worth the time to really take it and understand it so that you can get the maximum score. And one trick that I've sort of developed over the years and have gotten from other teachers as a recommendation is like, when we look at these scoring criteria, it can be tempting to really focus on this over here, like what is it going to be scored for? But sometimes it's actually better to focus on what it says in the do not, right? Because the readers have been coached in a lot of cases to focus on this area right here where it says do not award a point if this is true. And so the first row, the first point is actually for your video, and again, this is pretty straightforward. You really are going to get a point here unless you really botch the video or you do a bad job of describing your program. That's pretty straightforward. Where things start to get interesting is row 2 and beyond. So row 2 is about your list or your collection type, and it shows how your list is being used. It identifies the variable that list is associated with, and it describes what data is contained in the list. And then it also will include, you're going to basically attach 2 code segments to this answer, and I'm going to show you guys how we can do that pretty easily when it comes time to do your written responses. But you will have like your whole program code submitted as a PDF, and then for a lot of these individual written responses, you're going to submit a chunk of code. And again, we'll talk about how to do that. Looking at the do not award a point section for this row, right? It says the use of the list is trivial and does not assist in fulfilling the program's purpose. So again, going back to this idea, what does it mean trivial? I guess what does that mean, right? It basically means like the list is almost pointless and that you just kind of threw a list in there for no reason. So you can avoid this by approaching your code in the way that we talked about at the very beginning of the first video, which is saying, you know, approach the code in a way that you work on something that you're interested in working on and you're actually trying to solve problems, rather than just trying to shoehorn or force in a bunch of requirements into some random code. That, as long as you are developing the code from a place of inspiration or, you know, a place of your own sense of, you know, or your own desire, I should say, to solve a problem, you're really you're almost guaranteed that, you know, you're gonna have a list, you're gonna have functions. Those functions are gonna change the behavior of the program. It's just, that's part of programming, is that we get these things eventually in our code as we write it. So let's look at row 3, and this is actually where we're going to stop for this video, but let's take a look at it real quick. So row 3 is all about managing complexity. And managing complexity in the context of the list that you've included. So your written response should explain how the named and selected list manages complexity in the program code by explaining why the program code could not be written or how it would be written differently without using this list. And we already talked a little bit earlier about how managing complexity does not have to be this big evolution in your code. It can be a little improvement that still manages complexity, right? So let's look at the do not award a point for this one. It says, 1, the code segments containing the list are not separately included in the written response section. So this is basically like you didn't put the code there when in the written response. So we're not going to do that. You shouldn't do that. You should make sure you've got the appropriate code segments with each appropriate written response. Okay. The written response does not name the selected list, so you make sure you name it correctly and use the variable that you've used in the program. Okay, this is where things get interesting. So we already talked about how we don't want to use a list that is irrelevant to our program, right? So irrelevant is subjective, but as long as your list is used by your code and has an effect on the way the code runs and successfully organizes your code in some way, as opposed to having 10 variables, you've got 10 elements in a list, that meets this requirement. Okay. Obviously, if your explanation does not apply to the selected list, I don't know what to tell you. Don't do that. Okay, so this one says the explanation of how the list manages complexity is implausible, inaccurate, or inconsistent with the program. Let's talk about implausible. Plausibility means, could this really happen? Is it feasible or realistic that this thing is occurring or has occurred? And so if you say in your program, for example, that you've got this list of 10 elements in it, and you say, if I didn't use this list, I would have had 40,000 variables, right? Well, that's implausible. It doesn't make sense that a list of 10 elements manages complexity by removing 40,000 variables, right? That's just an example. So you've got to keep your explanation of how the list manages complexity realistic. Additionally, this goes back to the idea of not overselling what it does. Don't try to make it a huge deal. Just say it manages complexity in this simple way. That is just fine. Okay? Inaccurate, right? If you can't speak accurately about your code, that's a problem, right? What you say about your code should be true, and it should be precise, right? You should be able to say exactly what your code is doing, and if you can't, that's definitely an issue. That's usually an indicator that you didn't write the code, or you copy and pasted a snippet and you don't understand it. You can't do that and then write about it successfully, so don't do that. And then lastly, make sure that what you're saying is consistent with how the program actually behaves. Sometimes what can happen is students see behavior at one point as they're writing the code, and then they make some changes in the code, and then they go to write the written response, and they talk about it in the old way versus the way it works now. So don't do that. Make sure it's consistent with what you're doing. And the other one that's kind of hard to understand here is it says the solution without the list is implausible, inaccurate, or inconsistent with the program. So this is hard to read. I think they could have worded this a little bit better. But basically what they're saying is when you go to talk about why the program code could not be written or how it would be written differently without using the list, when you go to talk about that, that explanation also has to be plausible. It has to be accurate and consistent. So basically, again, don't describe the alternative solution as some ridiculous thing just to make your list sound good. Just talk about it as is. As long as your list is providing a little bit of complexity management, it's making the code a little bit simpler or easier to work with, then leave it at that, okay? The use of the list does not result in a program that is easier to develop, meaning alternatives presented are equally complex or potentially easier. So don't describe an easier solution than the list that you have. For example, don't have a list with 2 elements when you could have just used 2 variables, if that's appropriate, and then try to sell your list as better than that. That doesn't make sense either. So I mean, if you realize this as you're writing your response, then you should update your code and then maybe look around for another opportunity to use a list somewhere. In the end, like, your code should be complex enough, or should be a ambitious enough program that you've got adequate room for all this stuff. But definitely don't, present a list and then there's a really evident alternative that's easier. Okay. And then the use of the list does not result in a program that is easier to maintain, meaning that future changes to the size of the list would cause significant modifications to the code. I don't see a really obvious opportunity for this in Python. I guess I'd know it when I see it. But if for some reason a list that you build in Python would require some crazy modification in order to accurately use that list later, a lot of this is going to come down to how do you use the list in a future algorithm. And if that future algorithm is broken by changes to the size of the list, then yeah, that's a problem. Okay, so we've talked about this for a while. I'm going to leave it here for now. We'll continue to discuss the rubric next time. Make sure that you take some time to get familiar with the instructions. You need to read every line of this, understand it in detail for those pages that I shared with you on Google Classroom. And I look forward to maybe seeing you all today at virtual class and talking with you next week on another recorded lesson. Until then, have a great week and day.